All right, welcome everyone to the grand finale of Bio 347, NEU 547, Introduction to Neural Computation. Throughout this class, we've learned a lot of things. We learned about how brain processes information. We learned how sensory information is processed, tuning curves, sensory encoding, efficient coding, perception, decision making, working memory, all good stuff. Learning, motor controls and stuff. We also learned about how to make or program computers and machines to emulate the activities of networks of neurons, spiking neurons, and so on to perform certain computations. But we haven't discussed the big puzzle that we are all familiar with, which is our own consciousness. In the class debate preparation, you have all answered some surveys and you voted yourself as being conscious. So you do believe yourself is conscious and you believe Dr. Brinkman is conscious. But we haven't really discussed this in detail. The precise definition of consciousness, of course, is not well established, but we'll try to discuss as much as we can. And our topic today is whether machines can be conscious or not. So with that, let me introduce you to our moderator for the debate, Connor.
So this is how the debate's going to work. So the basic rule is we're going to have everybody in the audience already pick a side to the question, which is, can machines be conscious or not? And then we're going to hear from the panelists from both the affirmative and negative sides. And I'll specify basically, so each team, the yes and no team, are each going to have, they're going to have a 5-minute opening statement. And then they're going to have the ability to ask, questions of each other and respond, and then answer questions from the rest of you. And then that'll be it. And to determine who won, we're going to first take a vote before the debate starts and see where people stand on the issue. And then we're going to take another one when the debate's over and see, if they've changed anybody's mind. So with that, I will introduce the.
Can we quickly make sure that everybody votes now? So on Zoom.
Yeah. Oh yeah, totally, absolutely.
Reactions. Press either yes or no if you're if you think machines can be conscious. Press yes. Otherwise, no. And we'll tally this.
Where's the IDK option?
There's no IDK option. You have to be either one of the two. Are you 50-50 exactly?
I'm trying to look at reactions right now. All right, I got it.
It's in the bottom of the screen. It'll be always in the bottom of the screen during the debate. So you'll see the numbers changing.
Oh, nice. All right. Yeah, so as soon as, if something's changing your mind, change it so that we can see it happening in real time. So it is 9-4 and 21 against. Yeah. All right, so panelist 1 on the yes team, I can time it on my phone, but you have 5 minutes to make your opening statement.
Okay, so we believe that machines are empirically conscious. So one thing we'd like everybody to keep in mind throughout this debate is that the scientific method relies on being falsifiable, and we have a definition of consciousness that is consistent, universal, and falsifiable, unlike our opponents. So how do we define consciousness? So an object is conscious if after external stimulus, it provides a novel internal action. So machines can be conscious. So consciousness is a sliding scale that describes all objects in the universe. A conscious object would be one that changes itself due to external inputs. So the efficiency of the stimulus input to the external action would define how conscious an object is. So if there are two objects receiving the same external stimulus, the object that displays more external actions is more conscious than the object that displays less external actions. So an action in this case is defined by any measurable change the object possesses. So this definition removes all the inconsistencies each scholar explicates because many different scientists are discussing different levels of consciousness. So I'd like to introduce a complex and simple prefix to consciousness and see how it can be used to compare different organisms. So let's compare the sea sponge to fishes. So many sea sponges contract and expand when more food is present nearby. So when you compare this to a fish, for example, a fish will move itself to food to eat the food while simultaneously scanning for nearby predators. So the fish's consciousness is more complex than the sea sponge because it produces more actions given the same stimulus. So when discussing our own consciousness, comparing other animals, we believe are conscious, it would be properly describing by calling it complex mammalian consciousness. So if you consider a human in a white room and a cat in another white room, they both contain complex mammalian consciousness, so they were both conscious. However, if a mirror is presented, the cat will move around but does not recognize it as itself. So when we compare that to a human notices any movement as its own and therefore notices the person on the in its reflection to be itself. Therefore, in that aspect of the action of self-awareness, human consciousness is more complex. So when we think about babies, for example, in the mirror test, babies are not self-aware until around 18 months of age. Therefore, our definition of consciousness is not contingent on self-awareness. So our definition of consciousness does not demonstrate any mammalian bias because there are some actions that humans are not conscious to, but other animals are. So when we consider the magnetoreception of birds, for example, when given magnetic stimuli, humans do not demonstrate any change in itself, whereas the mentioned animals do. So when we talk about machines, for example, if we use an iPhone, for example, the phone has GPS locations on constantly and can sense where it is. So as a result of this, it can change the time zone of where it is. And if you look at the battery of an iPhone, for example, if its internal battery is low, the iPhone will automatically change itself and put itself in a battery saving mode. So this can demonstrate a simple level of consciousness, just like a sea sponge. So when we look at higher levels of artificial intelligence, they demonstrate a higher level of consciousness. So it should be noted that machines such as light switches are not conscious because the action is dependent on the external switch, but no internal change. So in the same way, a portion of DNA in isolation is not conscious. So if we look at examples of things we consider not to be conscious, so a rock, for example, the stone. So an external stimulus produces an external result. So if I want to move a stone, I would have to physically push it. So when we compare that to a cat, for example, a cat, an external stimulus produces an internal result, which in turn produces an external stimulus. So our definition of consciousness does not rely on mammalian bias and is not contingent on self-awareness. And our definition is measurable. So that is all.
Good. Wonderful. And so I will have the first person from the no team arguing in the negative that machines cannot be conscious give their opening statement now. If we're ready with we can start the clock. All right.
Okay. Hello, fellow conscious beings. So I'll be representing our team, Alex, Arij, and I. We believe that machines are not capable of having consciousness. And so I'm going to start off with how we define consciousness. And so we define consciousness as being able to distinguish between how the brain processes information and our experience of that processing. And so consciousness would involve being able to formulate and process complex patterns of information, such as awareness of one's surroundings, justifying our decision-making, emotions, sensations, and feelings. And so consciousness is more than just physical matter, and it's beyond any piece of code that a machine is programmed to base outputs off of. We say that machines are not capable of having consciousness because they don't understand or comprehend their computations. And so, for example, if we were to look at the Chinese room thought experiment, which we had to look at for homework 7, the computer took in Chinese characters as an input, and it would output Chinese characters, which were dependent on coded instructions in its programming. And so although the computer, gave the impression that it's a Chinese speaker, it was simply just acting based on the program without actually understanding what the input or output meant. And so we say that without intentionality, the computer can't be thinking, or, moreover, it can't have a mind of its own. And so that would refute the idea that machines have consciousness. And then we can go into the concept of qualia, which could be described as, ineffable raw feelings that we can't physically feel ourselves, but we can try to gain knowledge on to try to understand how someone else with that physical sensation may be feeling. And so our inability to connect physical phenomena to these raw feelings, and basically our inability to explain and share our own internal qualia would be known as the explanatory gap. And so what the explanatory gap will look into is that, no amount of description will actually allow another person to experience their qualia in the exact same way. And so in 1983, actually, there was a philosopher, Joseph Levine, and he proposed that there's an explanatory gap between our understanding of the physical world and our understanding of consciousness as well. And so he was saying how consciousness is a phenomenon. So it stands that a full description of the physical nature of a conscious organism should result in a recreation of its consciousness, or creating that consciousness with full description. And so what this would mean is that the conclusion, which would be referred to the qualia, must follow necessarily from the premises, and the premises would be considered to be the specifications of the conscious organism, like a full description. And so theoretically speaking, this is just theoretical, but if you were to take it from a realistic standpoint, which Joseph Levine also, goes into and explains, is that no matter how complete a physical explanation is, it would not entail subjective consciousness. And so in other words, in other terms, no matter how well you physically, describe a conscious organism, it still won't recreate subjective consciousness. And so this could go into when you go to create a machine that you want to be conscious, at the end of the day, it's like you just have a machine, it's just physical. And so for a machine to be conscious, you would need to create something that's beyond physical. And as of now, that's just not possible. So for these reasons, we believe that unlike us as humans, machines cannot have consciousness. And that's
all right.
That's the point.
That's great. And props to both of you guys for keeping it concise. I was kind of expecting these things to roll a little over the time limit. But one thing before we continue, the next part of this, we're going to have the questioning and rebuttal. So the second person on each team will, as it says in the rules, can question the person who gave the opening statement, and they have an opportunity to respond. But before that, one thing I actually forgot at the beginning is each team can pick either Dr. Brinkman or Dr. Park to help them out answering one question. And I figured I would do that right before the part where people are going to be asked questions come out. So each team can, I guess, decide amongst yourselves on which backup you want to pick, which one of these scientific heavyweights you want
so
to pick.
I believe the team that had less initial support got to pick first.
So that would be the people claiming that machines can be conscious.
So we would like to pick Dr. Brinkman.
Okay.
All right. So the way this is next going to work is the second person from the team that went first, so the yes team, is going to question the second person in the team that went second, so the no team. And no, of course, they're going to specifically ask those questions, but the other panelists can also chime in. And the first team will have 5 minutes to ask questions, and the second team will then have 10 minutes to answer them. And I guess this is going to be approximate if we're going back and forth, but we can keep some sort of timing on the total amount of time that you're spending asking the questions, maybe, because we don't, as we said earlier, we want to be able to make it more natural. And then basically, I guess the best way to do this probably is just we're going to have two 15-minute blocks. In the first 15-minute block, the yes team will question the no team. And in the second 15-minute block, the no team will question the yes team. And this is the, then half an hour later, we'll move on to the questions by the audience. Does anybody have any questions? All good. All right, so team one, the yes team. If you're all good, we can start up the clock and you can question the no team. But
one of the things that the other side mentioned was that machines are not necessarily self-aware. However, this is kind of inconsistent with previous studies. So there are various studies that show that babies are not self-conscious prior to the 18 months. So if they believe that machines are self-conscious, are not self-conscious, and which therefore means that they don't have consciousness, they would also have to suggest that babies prior to the 18 months are not conscious beings. I'm not sure would you take that stance? You can respond if you'd like.
Would I take the stance of babies not being conscious under 18 months?
Under 18 months. Because they don't show any self-awareness.
What are you defining as self-awareness here?
So the experiment that we're discussing is the mirror experiment. And so what they did was they put a dot on the baby and they presented a mirror in front of the baby. And so if the baby touches the dot on the mirror, then they think that the babies would think that it's another baby in front of them. But if they touch themselves, that they recognize that that baby in front of them, it's them in the mirror. Does that make sense?
I mean, that makes sense, but I wouldn't consider that to be the sole definition of self-awareness because most animals don't pass that test as well. That's more of a test of like, are you aware that this specific external thing is also yourself? I would more say self-awareness is related to internal processes around your own actions.
Well, babies have internal processes as well, and so do machines. But so why is it that machines get this exclusion, whereas many organisms don't?
I think that is kind of along the lines of the Chinese room experiment. A machine is doing something, but it doesn't necessarily understand what it's doing. So a machine that takes Chinese language as input and takes or puts Chinese language out as output, it doesn't necessarily understand Chinese, or it doesn't even understand what it's saying. It just has this predefined input-output method, as opposed to conscious organisms, which...
Now to that, I would actually, I would slightly disagree. So if you took the same experiment and you would give it to dogs, and then you would give the same experiment to humans, right? Like a dog wouldn't perceive Chinese characters in the same way that humans would, right? That doesn't mean that the dog is not conscious, right? Unless you would argue that the dog is not conscious because it can't perceive Chinese characters in the same way that humans do.
The dog is perceiving them. It's not it's perceiving them, and it's not understanding the language, but it is still having a subjective response to those. So I'm not really sure what the comparison you have there is.
Well, the comparison that I'm trying to say is that like the machines responding to the Chinese characters, it's a different type of consciousness. Just like in the same way where if a dog perceives a Chinese character, it is a different kind of consciousness. It's not like they literally know Chinese, right? Humans can learn Chinese, but dogs can't. And a machine, when they perceive that Chinese character, it's just a different type of consciousness or a different experience.
I would disagree that it's a different type of consciousness. They're perceiving it in a different way.
So you agree that they are perceiving it though?
No, dogs are perceiving it in a different way.
Right, dogs, machines, and humans.
Dogs are perceiving it in a different way than humans. I don't think machines, they're perceiving it. It's just an input that then alters its internal, the input gets run through its internal code, and then it spits out an output. It's not understanding, it's not even perceiving, it's just an input output.
if something is an input output, right? Like we take in inputs and then we have an output of some sort, right? What is the difference between our internal mechanism that a machine doesn't have? You said that it's lines of code, right? Well, our neurons behave similarly, not the same, where the input is taken and it's propagated and changed to create an output, right? This is similar to how machines, not only digital, but even mechanical, work as well. So what's the distinction?
I would argue the distinction is that in a machine, if you entirely replicate the machine, you'll have the same machine. It'll perform the same function and have the same response. Whereas if you were to perfectly replicate a human, every single neuron, down to the atom, I don't think it would be the same, because I think that consciousness extends further than just the matter in it.
Now, to that, I would actually disagree. So there are many types of AI. You can use the Tesla model, for example, and even if you were to give them the same exact stimulus, they would actually perform different external reactions, or it would drive differently based on the same exact stimulus.
Does it have the same exact internal state
Sure.
when the stimulus is given?
Right. The way AI works is that it would do things just a little bit differently because the internal mechanism is complex enough, as we've been arguing, such that it would make a decision based on various inputs internally, even if the inputs and the internal mechanism is the same. This has been proven time and time and again with various studies regarding Tesla, in fact.
So it's a machine that takes the exact same input with the exact same internal state and produces a different output. What is the mechanism that causes it to have a different output?
I mean, if you want to get into the details, like there's a lot of like random variables, but we don't need to get into it. But if you'd like,
one question I actually have right here is, first of all, other participants, you should also talk. This is a great exchange though, and I think you should absolutely keep going on this. Just to be clear, is the position of the team arguing that machines can be conscious, that machines as they currently exist are conscious?
Our position as it stands is that any object that has a external stimulus placed upon it, which has an internal mechanism that causes it to change itself, is conscious, which includes some machines, but not all.
So what would be examples of some machines that well, actually, yeah, I guess that answers my question. So you guys actually, yes, you can get back to in the position of the team arguing that machines can't be conscious. You're arguing that machines, like broadly construed, including like I mean, in principle, any sort of a computer could not have what we consider consciousness. Is that correct? I just want to be clear what the positions of the two teams are.
That's correct, yeah.
Can I add something here? So many of the developments in artificial intelligence extend to biomedical engineering. So for example, Elon Musk was able to, I'm going to oversimplify here, but Elon Musk was able to replicate certain simulations in, I believe it was a pig brain, such that the pig itself didn't have to move, but it was able to perceive certain stimuli from a biomedical device external to the body, right? So would you say that that experience is consciousness or not?
Well, just to butt in again, that we've done that in humans with cochlear implants since the 1980s. So yeah, a computer device that, I'm not sure what Elon Musk did, but yeah, cochlear implants are a common example of a sensor that is ultimately an electronic sensor that inputs into the cochlea, and people use them to hear, people talk. My neighbor, when I was growing up, actually had one.
So the question is basically if that is something that can be used as an input, so long as there's an internal mechanism, and if it makes an output, if it quacks like a duck, it should be a duck.
I'm confused as to the argument with the pig and the external stimuli, because the pig is conscious. it's taking an external stimuli from a machine, but I just don't see how that question's relevant.
It's to answer your previous question to how is it that a machine internally could have any sensory input to basically have that mechanism go forth. Right, that was your question before?
My question before was in regards to the Tesla AI. What is the method it uses to generate the different output? What is different?
So in the algorithm, it uses a random variable. The way it determines the random variable is a topic for another time, but it uses a random variable to generate a response in the internal mechanism of itself. And because of that, it is chaotic by nature, which is similar to our neurons. It is chaotic by nature. And therefore, it produces a variety of complex responses. And for the Tesla AI, right, it because of that, we expect there, and it does, generate a wide variety of responses given the same response and given the same inputs and internal mechanism.
But you just said it uses a random variable in its internal mechanism, and the random variable will be different each time. So every time at the exact moment it's presented with the input, its internal state will be different from another machine that has a different value for that random variable at that time. So the internal state is still different.
Hold on, are you arguing that if you took like a carbon copy of a person, let's take me, right? Like me as a person, and you completely copied me, put me in a parallel universe such that like we don't interact with anything at all, right? And we have the same exact experience. Are you saying that we're going to have a different response in terms of consciousness?
Yes.
You think we're going to do different things and perceive consciousness completely differently, and we would do different things?
Not completely differently, but it wouldn't be exactly the same. It's obviously like an incredibly theoretical question because we're talking about parallel universes at this point.
No, but the question is asking, because you're assuming that the internal mechanisms is exactly the same, which it can't be. But going with your hypothetical, I'm asking you, if we would have two conscious beings that have the same exact internal mechanism and external sensory output and external sensory inputs, which experience things in the same exact way, would their perception, the content, not the index, would the content be the same?
What is the difference between the content and the index when you ask that?
Like, you know, a brar1 versus a brar2.
So if you had the exact same organism with the exact same physical arrangement of matter,
right,
then yes, I do think that they would experience consciousness differently.
Why? What special property that you propose exists that doesn't exist in versus me versus a brar1 versus a brar2? Because if you can't come up with that mechanism, then that's not science. Like, that's just a black box. You have to show something that's measurable.
But that's the explanatory gap. I could turn that around and say that as we currently, with our current understanding, that's basically turning the whole debate into which one of us has the onus of explaining the explanatory gap, which is an unsolved question.
Well, I'm saying, since we are suggesting that any object that has any external input, which has an internal mechanism, right, which produces any sort of external output, that is an object that's conscious, and we have something that's measurable. The onus is on you to explain why something that fits that definition isn't conscious.
Well, at that point, we're just disagreeing on what the definition of consciousness is.
Then what is your definition of consciousness? You have 30 seconds, go.
Yeah, my definition of consciousness is kind of as we said in our opening statement, in that it's the ability to experience subjective like qualia. And so a subjective response means it's not going to be the same with the exact same input.
But remember, qualia, as you've described it, it is not a measurable component. This is not science. This is philosophy.
Yeah, this is a philosophical debate.
Well, but remember, if we're trying to explain something through rational means, we should have a rational explanation for something that exists.
Rational explanations are always nice. This is a good exchange. The one thing Abrar brought up that I have to reference is the idea of what would happen if Abrar was duplicated completely down to the atom, and that is there's a famous philosopher who actually recently died named Derek Parfit who wrote a famous book called Reasons and Persons in the 1980s, where he explores this in the context of what he calls a teletransportation machine. And it's basically that. Imagine you had a duplicator. Like if anybody's ever seen the movie, which I'm not sure if anyone's seen, but it's basically like the machine in that movie where, what is that? He's dealing with this question of identity, which is somewhat related to consciousness, because in a lot of cases, people will argue, it's a debate in philosophy of what makes me, right? And some people have talked about, so that's where he kind of developed this thought experiment. But he has this question of what would happen if I was duplicated? How would I experience that? Does my consciousness split in two? Are both clones conscious? What would happen if, one of the clones if I was disintegrated here and reassembled on another planet, would that person be the same person as me? What if I was just copied? So there's a lot of those thought experiments, and they're really interesting in terms of what they say about, what they say about consciousness, because it is an interesting question of to explore if we're trying to figure out, well, can a machine be conscious? You guys absolutely hit on the right point, both of you, that it is very important to have a definition of this, and a definition of this is hard. And it is, as Alex points out, there's a lot of unsolved questions, and this question of burden of proof is a little tricky, right? But all right, so we're about to move on to the next phase. I don't want to lecture you guys. I think this is a really good exchange, and I just want y'all to keep talking. All right, so we've started.
Okay, I guess I could start off by asking the first question. So I would ask anyone on the other team, what would you say is the defining difference between a machine that's truly conscious versus a machine that's merely just imitating consciousness? And is there a line that can be drawn between them?
So our position here is that there is no line, because supposed imitation, if you're doing the same function and it does a similar job as something that is supposedly conscious, it should be conscious as well, right? If an object is blue and then you have another object that looks blue, it should be blue. Or it's imitating blue. Does that make sense?
So you would say there's no such thing as imitating consciousness, it's only pure consciousness?
There's no such thing as imitating consciousness, there's only pure consciousness. Remember, for us, consciousness is on a sliding scale. So we have things that are not conscious, so like rocks, and then things that are complex, like complex consciousness, such as ourselves. And so when you're saying imitating, right, we would say on our side that it would just be on a different line on that scale.
So would you say there's any machine that you would consider to be not conscious at any point?
A good one that Ariz was talking about earlier is a light switch. So a light switch is not conscious. And I say that's probably where the line is properly drawn, because there is an external stimulus, but there is no real change in internal stimulus. If you flip a switch, it just has an immediate external response. There's no internal mechanism that has any propagation effects, which causes the light switch to respond. However, it should be noted that multiple light switches as a component can be used for conscious objects.
So you said that a light switch has no internal mechanisms going on, which I would disagree with, because when you flip the light switch, it closes the circuit and it changes the electrical path that electrons are flowing through in that circuit. Mm-hmm. And then once the electrons go into the light bulb, it in filament-based light bulbs, it heats up the filament, which then produces light. So how is that not a change in an internal state?
It would not be a change in the internal state. It's because, okay. To answer Terrence's question, a smart light would be something that is conscious because there's an internal mechanism going on. Okay, well, let me properly define this. If you were to push a rock, right, there is also an internal, based on your definition, an internal mechanism going on with gravity, which pushes the rock down when you push it, and then a velocity that takes it forward, right? And the quantum mechanics of that is also technically an internal mechanism. However, when we talk about it, it has to be an internal mechanism that is complex enough to alter itself. Does that make sense?
Okay, so I
It's
think
like,
What I'm imagining the kind of way to simplify this is that you guys have a view of a framework for viewing machines as something that takes inputs and generates outputs. And your idea is consciousness is a sliding scale that only applies to machines that have some internal state that can make them give a different output for like the same input. And that scale increases as the complexity of those internal states increase. Is that kind of definition?
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly. And so yeah, I just wanted to clear that up.
also, just adding on to that point, I believe that, a light switch, when it's just a regular old-fashioned light switch, there is no perception of its external surroundings the way a smart light, like Terrence suggested, a smart light could absolutely perceive, if it's day outside and it does not need to be on, or it can perceive that it's night and can turn on by itself. And that level of perception of its external surroundings is what gives it, more consciousness, or like, I guess that's where you can say we draw the line of consciousness.
what's the difference? Like saying that like a smart light where it uses the external light level to determine if it's turned on or off, I could just argue that a regular light switch is using the external stimuli of is the switch flipped up or is the switch flipped down to be
but
its
that
external stimuli.
but
How
that
is that
flip
any smarter?
that flip comes from someone else, like a human, whereas this is not, a smart light is not being flipped in any way. It's just, it's existing, it's whatever, plugged in maybe, but it's perceiving it on its own through its own internal mechanism, and it uses sensors or whatever it is to perceive that light level outside of its composition, of outside of its body, and there's no human or any other thing flicking it on its own.
So just to be clear,
what if
under
I
this
take-
definition of consciousness, all life forms, probably even like certain types of viruses, would be considered conscious.
That would be correct.
So including
Yes.
probably COVID-19.
Including all kingdoms.
So all
We-
kingdoms of the biological.
Like animals, plants,
Plants, protists,
fungi.
bacteria, fungi, all of those should be at some scale, some form of consciousness. Not
Yeah, and
complex
we-
mammalian
yeah.
consciousness, but a simple consciousness, at least.
There's a spectrum of consciousness. That's what we believe. It's not like everyone is on a human level of consciousness where they experience emotion and all that. But there is definitely some at least small level of consciousness in which it is allowed to survive and perceive.
And again, for us, this is measurable. It's the efficiency of the output and the internal mechanism that allows for this complexity to arise.
So how are you measuring efficiency in this case? I know you mentioned that in your opening statement, it was along the lines of a greater response to the same external action is what you described as efficiency.
Yeah, here, I'll give a proper example. So let's say we had a cat and we had a stone of a cat. So it's a stone in the shape of a cat. If I were to push the stone, which we agree is on the probably the lowest end of consciousness, you could even say has nil consciousness, no consciousness at all. That stone would have not much external actions. However, the cat, because of its internal mechanisms, through its nervous system, it doesn't need to have a nervous system, but it does. It produces a wide variety of external responses. So it lands on its feet, for example, which is something that's measurable. We can see the brain waves, we can measure the muscle activity, based on the activity on those brainwaves and such forth.
Okay, but now in that same situation, let's say you have a rock and a house plant. If you push the house plant off the table, it's going to fall just the same as the rock. So is a plant on the same level of consciousness as a rock?
That's honestly a very good question. So in this context, if you were to push a plant and you were to push a rock, this level of consciousness is not given to the plant. However, it should be noted, if you were to push a plant and its soil is like, it still gives it nutrients, the plant will move itself such that it still receives the sunlight, which is an action.
But that's not necessarily a response to the stimuli. That's a response to
A
the
change in the
environment.
external environment. Exactly.
So what if you pushed the plant and it landed in a spot where it didn't need to change at all? It still landed in a spot. Let's say you push the plant off of a table, or
Okay.
you drop a plant onto the table.
Okay.
The pot doesn't break, the soil doesn't move, the plant's in the exact same amount of sunlight as before. That plant's not going to do anything.
Okay, so let me make sure I'm getting this right. So you push your plant, right? You're doing the pushing, and then it magically lands such that the soil is in the exact same spot and the sunlight is in the exact same spot, right?
Yeah.
Okay. And so the plant wouldn't move. Movement is not like a proxy for consciousness, but
Well, you're saying that external
right, it's an
external
external stimulus.
responses or external reactions are a proxy for consciousness, because that's your definition. A
I
greater
think
response is greater consciousness.
you're not all stimuli should produce some sort of external response. Like for us, right? We do not perceive, or we don't have magnetoreception, right? But that doesn't make us not conscious.
But you're claiming to have a consistent measure of consciousness, but it's not consistent.
It is consistent because, again, you're suggesting that if we can't perceive magnetoreception, right, as birds and other species do, that we would have no consciousness. What we're describing is that our consciousness is on a different sliding scale than those species.
But you're at this point, for that to be correct, it would have to be multiple sliding scales. Like you would have to have a sliding scale of consciousness for responding to being pushed, and then a sliding scale of responsiveness for responding to magnetic frequencies.
Exactly. That's exactly what we're arguing for.
So you're
Because
saying that
different
consciousness
sensory inputs require to be received and then have an output, right? Like, unless you were to just, let's take a person, right? Since a lot of people here probably think that if they're feeling something or if they're experiencing an emotion, that shows that they are conscious, right? But there are people who exist that don't have that, like they're neurodivergent enough to not have those stimuli be properly adjusted and then have the same response that humans do. I'm sorry, that us neurotypical people would have. You would suggest, therefore, that they have a lower level of consciousness than we do.
No, I'm saying entirely that I don't think there's a sliding scale of consciousness, because you can't consistently apply that scale to any organism.
Why not? We're doing it right now.
Well, no, you're saying that there's an infinite amount of sliding scales for the infinite amount of possible stimuli.
No, we're suggesting that any measurable stimuli, like muscle growth or a magnetoreception or proprioception or sight, any sort of input is something that's conscious.
Really quick interruption here. I want to make sure we do get everybody covered. So, Arij, you haven't talked yet. I want a question from you, because I want to make sure everybody on every team has asked a question of the other team. This won't be true cross-examination.
Of course. So I just want to bring attention to a point that you brought up earlier, where you said that, if it quacks like a duck, it is a duck. So that whole thing is when we define consciousness, we talked about qualia, which is very central to our whole definition, where we say that subjective consciousness is like experiencing something, but the explanatory gap arises because we're not able to understand how other people experience something or other conscious beings experience something. So would you say that in your definition, you believe that what we say makes us conscious, like emotions or sensations or feelings, you don't think that's central to something being conscious?
Yeah, I would completely agree with that. Emotions and feelings is a component of our mammalian complex consciousness.
I
So
also
would you
think
say
that.
that?
Oh, my bad. Continue.
No, okay. So would you say that other like animals that are like, not mammals, they don't have emotions or feelings? So that doesn't contribute to their consciousness or their subjective experience?
You're presupposing they don't have feelings or emotions, right?
I'm asking you if you think that.
If can you pick an organism that you think doesn't have emotions or feelings?
No, I think that all conscious beings, all animals are conscious. They all have feelings, and that is what contributes to their subjective experience, the way they experience something like qualia that cannot be explained, which makes them separate from beings that are not conscious, like a machine or like a plant.
I think we have a little bit of a difference in our definition of feeling. When I say feeling, I really mean like perceiving something. So like sight, vision, etc. Emotions are a sense for us. It's a social sense where we can express and then also understand another, either human or usually typically other mammals. That is a sense which also contributes to our consciousness.
Okay, so you do agree that it is something that makes us conscious, or something that makes any being conscious?
It can. It's not a requisite. You don't need it to be conscious. It's just something that we can sense, therefore is an external stimulus for us to produce an external reaction, and therefore contributes to our consciousness. You don't need an organism to have emotions in order for it to be conscious. Does that make sense?
I don't agree with that, because I don't believe that a machine as it exists, or even AI, I don't believe that it has the experience of qualia at all. Like it cannot, like it knows the color red because we teach it that this is red and it just memorizes that. But that's not how humans or other conscious beings see it. Like, does that make sense?
Wait, say that one more time. The color red thing.
So the color red thing, right? So if you teach an AI what a color red is, right? So it's just gonna look at it and like, kind of just memorize it. It's not really gonna ever understand what it means for anything to even be a color, right?
So, as Alvin is pointing out, right? Like different cultures are also memorizing colors as well. Like in certain Greek and Turkish cultures, I think it's the color blue and green. They perceive that as the same color. Whereas for Western cultures, we have distinct like words for the color blue and the color green. So we are memorizing in a way, but it's the sensing that leads to the consciousness. So animals that have chromatoreceptors or photoreceptors, they can perceive color in their experience, leading to consciousness.
Can I interject a little bit here to help our team?
I also had an interjection.
Okay, so let me ask one question to you. When you see, let's say blue, since we're in blue-green spectrum here, when you see blue, do you subjectively experience blue? Do you feel blue?
I would say that I experience the color blue.
Okay, then if you say, let's say I have a piece of machine that detects the spectrogram and spits out if it's blue, yes, if it's not, no. Does that machine subjectively experience that blueness?
Yes, but in a different way for us humans would. Like for example, I think bees can visualize, or they can take in ultraviolet light, right? They would perceive the color blue in a different way than us humans would. And I would project that onto the machine, saying that if they can, it would just be a different experience than us humans would. But they're still perceiving a blue. Does that make sense?
Of course, they're perceiving a blue. I'm not saying they're not perceiving it. I'm talking about the subjective experience. You said you experience it and you feel it.
Yeah.
But earlier, you denied that qualia is not a scientifically measurable thing. It's not well defined. But you just admitted yourself that you have qualia.
Well, qualia, as you've described it, sure, yeah. I have the subjective experience of my color blue, but even this experience is different amongst us humans. Like perhaps my color blue is slightly different from your color blue, which is typical for conscious beings because our internal mechanism would be slightly different for the perception of blue.
I am not claiming that we have the same subjective experience. I'm only asking that if you have subjective experience. As Sharika was saying earlier, this qualia itself is a key component that's not explainable in a physical manner. And you just admitted that you have this property, which is, according to you, is not scientific. But I did measure it by asking you. Okay, I'm going to stop here.
Do you want me to respond to that or?
Up to you.
Okay, I'll respond. So if you want to use qualia as a way to describe something, we should expect that internal mechanisms perceive things differently, which would in turn produce a qualia of some sort, right? Hold on, I want to collect my thoughts here. Okay, yeah. So, like, for example, like if I experience a blue, right, I would have a qualia of that blue. And then if I had another person, let's say you, professor, if you were to experience that blue, you would also have a qualia of perceiving that blue, which would be different. This difference extends to machines because their perception uses different sensory inputs, which therefore would lead to a greater difference. However, they're still sensing something which has an internal mechanism, which then gives it an external response. Therefore, it should be conscious. All
right. So we're going to move on to the third part of the debate here, where we have questions by the audience. So people can begin. We can put like 15 minutes on the clock, maybe, because I know we're running out of time.
No, Max, I think we're about to ask the same question, actually.
Oh, well, my question is, I feel like people are defining consciousness, or at least it felt like the Can't Be Conscious team was sort of like just teetoing around the idea that consciousness requires self-awareness. So I just, I was wondering what evidence they could provide of humans having true how do we demonstrate that something has self-awareness at a level that would be, like in terms of a test that we could apply to a machine?
I wouldn't say that self-awareness was our only way of defining consciousness, or even the most important one. The most important one was the ability to subjectively experience things, so with qualia. And then as far as a test that could be applied to machines to determine consciousness, that's definitely a difficult one, because like our stance is that consciousness doesn't arise purely from physical matter. So it's hard to even prove consciousness. That's actually like a pretty big philosophical debate, is that how can you know anything but yourself is conscious? So that doesn't fully answer your question, but it's kind of an unanswered question that you're asking.
I wasn't asking for proof. I was just asking for like, what sort of attributes of a self-aware, what sort of attributes do you consider to be something a self-aware system would have? Like
the ability to understand that it is subjectively perceiving or subjectively experiencing. I'm not sure if that's a good explanation, but.
It looks like Ben's raising their hand. I'm not sure for who, but you go for it.
And then Noah and then Terrence. Both of you guys, I know both I saw have questions. So Ben, Noah, Terrence.
Yeah, I think this can be a general question, but so I think I'll start with the can't be conscious side. It seems like you assume that machines have a deterministic way of processing things and that a certain input will produce the exact same output. But what about a machine that has some kind of stochastic element? If I think Abrar mentioned, if you have a model that has some random state or some random variable, if you input the same stimuli and you get maybe a slightly different perception of the color blue, or how would this relate to, would this be considered subjective? Would this be considered something like qualia? I'll keep it open-ended. I won't, yeah.
Basically, the most general answer I can give to that is that deterministic in this case, perhaps it's not the best word, but deterministic means it can be replicated purely through physical processes. So a machine is an arrangement of matter in a very specific way, and you can basically, through the entire process of it responding to a stimuli, you can trace its physical arrangement of matter at every, through its process, and then reproduce that. Whereas in humans, I would disagree that you could do that because, again, like our stance is that consciousness doesn't arise purely from physical matter.
So there do exist machines in which you can replicate every part of the process, but once you get to that random part, you cannot predetermine, you cannot know what the output is going to be.
But then
would you concede that those exist?
I can see that those exist, but they have a different state, a different arrangement of physical matter afterwards, because they're like you said, like they have a random process at some point in there.
Wouldn't humans who have some kind of random process fall into that category? Are we machines?
No. That's again the stance we have is that consciousness doesn't arise purely from physical matter.
Thank you.
Okay. Terrence, you can go.
Oh, okay. Thanks. Yeah, so I was gonna ask, this goes back to like the homework too, about how evolution arises and how it's part of our level of consciousness. And going to the debate, I want to ask, like, what's the difference between the consciousness of a robot and a human when a robot is predetermined by lines of code? And basically for every input, there's an output already predetermined to it. If there's some kind of evolutionary process, to like advance it, who's to say that like the code already is pre-programmed for it, while humans are learning from it, and basically it's more random than a robot could be. And this question
I'm going to answer this. So I think I want to kind of define this like machines are just sources of code. There are many different kinds of machines, and some kinds of machines have code in them. There are some types of AI, for example, that change its own code to suit its own need. And so for something like that, right, like it's not predetermined. Humans and many AI today, no creator, none of us humans made it. Like it made itself.
If I can add on to that, Terrence, you brought up the idea of predetermination, and I think that's very interesting. And obviously, machines that we know are running on code. However, the electrical signals that run through our body and our neural connections is quite similar to these neural networks that we talk about in artificial systems. And although, maybe I don't agree that humans are totally predetermined, there are certainly many evolutionary factors and behavioral factors such as imprinting, learning, or like innate behaviors, reflexes that are kind of just coded into our system and into our being. Like we don't think about these things, but we run on habits more than we think. So I don't believe that humans are completely like free of predetermination. So, and also, when a machine, like such as a highly advanced machine that runs on a neural network algorithm, and it uses randomness, I believe that the human brain is, first of all, it's completely like, it's not completely studied, and we don't know exactly how decisions are made between neurons. And I believe that there is a level of randomness in between neurons, and that we can most likely are stochastic in that way. For example, if we were given a certain problem, and to arrive at a solution for such a problem, we would need to cycle through different solutions and use, our creativity. That's probably where our creativity comes from, an element of randomness. And I believe that it's, similar to machine. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. One more quick question. I saw in the chat, Lamisa, you had something about, we're getting close to time, but you had a interesting point that very much followed this very well.
Yeah, sure. So my question was, so for the can't be conscious, you're saying that, would you say that something that's programmed can't be conscious because it's programmed and it's following some sort of code?
Wait, so if something is programmed, it can't be conscious. Is that what you're asking?
Sorry, I meant for can't be conscious. Like, are you saying that if something is programmed, therefore it's not conscious because it was pre-programmed? I'm going to take that as a yes. In that case, would you say that a human is also not conscious since we're programmed by our DNA and external stimuli?
I'm a bit.
So,
No, you can go.
okay, yeah. So I was going to say, if we're talking about the machine and it's programmed and it's just working within its code, then it's not conscious because it's not, quote unquote, like thinking beyond the code. Like it's just giving an output based on an input, so it can't have consciousness. And then for humans, even though like we have like neural synapses and things that can be like measurable in that sense, when you only focus on that, there's still that explanatory gap which we talked about, and it's something that's beyond just our measurable physical attributes that we have within us. But for a machine that's programmed, it's not thinking beyond that. It doesn't what's it called? Like it's just working based off of the code. Whereas for humans, that's not the case.
I would can you just, I'm sorry, I just want to make sure I understand. So you're saying that machines can't, you know what, actually, should I respond or should I just answer questions? I don't want to take up time.
Respond, please.
Okay. So you're saying that if there are, as Lamisa quite correctly pointed out, if machines have lines of code, kind of similar to how humans have lines of code, you have to explain the difference. So the difference that you're suggesting is that there's this explanatory gap where, you can't really subjectively describe the conscious awareness that we're feeling. However, that same explanatory gap exists in machines. You also can't explain the subjective feeling that a machine, as for example, as complex as an AI, would experience as well. There is still an explanatory gap for that as well.
I would disagree that there's an explanatory gap because, again, you can go back and from the creation of the machine to whatever state it's currently in, you can trace every single event, every single arrangement of atoms in its internal state that it went through to get there and get that output.
You could do the same thing for humans, though.
I mean, we talked about that before and we disagree on that point. So
I had a question. I actually just put it into chat. this is for the can be conscious team. You define consciousness as variability of output based on certain input, right?
Correct,
So,
yeah.
okay, so then, and I think Max actually brought this situation up before. What if there's somebody who is in a fully paralyzed state, who's deaf, who's blind, who is fully blind to all input whatsoever, but they still have memories, they still have thoughts, they still have feelings, right? They still have spontaneous thoughts that can arise based on whatever whatever mental processes. How would that fit in with your definition of consciousness? Or would you even consider somebody like this conscious?
That's a great question, and I'm really glad you brought it up. So let me answer it this way. So let's take someone who's in a coma, right? There is still internal mechanisms going on. Like, for example, their heartbeat's still going, and there is some muscle twitching that's still happening. There are still some processes that are occurring. However, to bring your case to the more extreme case, suppose you had a person, a human, right, that has absolutely no sensory input, but does have an internal mechanism, right? So they can't, they have absolutely no external stimulus. So no heart, no brain, no nothing, right? We would just call that person dead. And I believe we all think that that person is not conscious.
Well, actually, I'm kind of asking about a slightly different thing. Actually, you brought up the coma example. But based on what I'm saying, I actually would not consider somebody in a coma conscious. I'm talking about somebody who is still has full control of their mental faculties and capacities, can still think and form thoughts and recreate memories, but has no response to external stimuli. Now, obviously, if this happens in the real world, I would assume this person would go insane pretty fast.
But they would still
Right.
have external stimuli. Like if they're forming memories and they're forming thoughts, right? That's a measurable thing that we can look in their brain.
Right, but how does that?
Sorry. I understand what your question is. So yes, that would be someone who is conscious.
Right, but then how does that fit in with your definition that consciousness requires input?
If they can still feel things in the same way that we do, but they just can't outwardly express it, they would just have, it would be the same level of consciousness, but they just wouldn't have the external stimulus to provide it. But there would still be some external stimulus that would exist. I don't know if that makes sense. Like
Right,
there's still
but they're not
stimulus.
responding. What I'm arguing is that they're not responding to some external stimulus. They're conscious by virtue of their qualia and subjective experience versus some external input.
Real quick, like if you think that someone's forming memories or thoughts, do you think that their brain would show any sort of internal mechanism which is measurable? So then, yeah, they would
if you
have
put them in an fMRI, they would have the signal. Yes.
Exactly. So that is an action, an external response. Therefore, they are conscious.
You're talking about output. I'm talking about input.
They have no input whatsoever. Like it's all closed off.
Right. Locked in syndrome, something like that.
Completely locked in, and they have like literally like they can't feel anything. They have no like do you understand what I'm saying? Not being paralyzed.
Yeah.
Being paralyzed is different from like having absolutely no input.
Yes. Let's say we severed their sensory neurons.
Okay, in that case,
completely.
The brain would be the conscious factor, not the body.
But again, my point is about the input to, be it the human, the brain, whatever it is, the input to the brain, right? There is no input to the brain. Okay, you can talk about temperature and all these sorts of things, but I'm proposing a hypothetical wherein there's no input whatsoever, but the brain still has memories and still has a consciousness.
So would you say
that
that a brain
fit
in a
into your
jar,
definition?
like a brain in a jar that has literally nothing, like that would just be a dead person. But if it is connected to a body and it gets food and like it receives oxygen, then that is still an input. You know what I mean?
Right, but
Yeah, locked-in syndrome body, I mean the
Interesting.
brain, could be dreaming, full color dream. Who is to say that's not a conscious person? I mean, it's not because of the oxygen.
Right. Yeah. My entire point comes down, and again, I think you responded as well as I would have wanted, but it comes down to the crux of the debate, which I felt like, is there a physical basis for qualia or is there not? But okay, I think we're over time. I think I asked my question. Thank you.
Do we have one last quick question?
A question for the conscious team.
Okay.
So you said that machines have a spectrum of consciousness. So do you believe that the machines that we are using currently have consciousness? And if so, then when I'm not using my phone, as one of the panelists from your group said that iPhone is conscious, right? Like in a way that it can sense that the battery is low and tell you that go in the power saving mode or like plug it to the charger. But if I'm not using my phone and if it's just laying there, there's no internal activity, then at that point, is it conscious or?
So there still is internal activity even when you turn, keep your phone off. That it sends like it's what, like IP address, GPS location, triangulation from its self towers. So it is still connected. Even when you do, sorry, go ahead.
If my phone like is on airplane mode, it's still
Right.
on. It's in airplane mode and the screen is off.
Mm-hmm.
It's not doing anything.
Yeah, but there still are calculations of its internal status. For example, like how if you I don't know, take your phone into the pool, there's like a moisture level detection that comes up, or an internal heating level. Like those things like always remain on even when in airplane mode. So there's still like a smartphone is definitely a smart enough machine that we would consider to be conscious, even when turned off.
Even with the battery out?
With the battery out, you would lose its energy source.
Yeah,
so assuming like it's the same way where if you just pull apart the brain and like you give it absolutely nothing, then it's just dead.
But so do you think you can revive people then?
Like I guess if you reconstructed it, sure.
I think that's outside of the scope of this debate, and I think we are out of time. This was wonderful. I really loved the whole back and forth, and I think one person, if I calculated correctly, one person switched to the machines can be conscious team at least. So let's declare the winner, the machines can be conscious team, and thank you for both teams. And yeah, this is a never-ending debate, really.
You guys did a great job on the other side.
Yeah, that was a very difficult debate. There was definitely a lot of good arguments.
Yeah, I think both sides did well at trying to define their version of consciousness and stick to that, and all of you did very well at sort of arguing within both the scope of your own definitions, but also trying to engage with the other team's definitions. But I think you all did very well, and as Dr. Park mentioned in the chat, we were also quite pleased to see the audience getting in on the discussions on the side and getting into their own side debates. That was very fun to read, and we're glad to have inspired such debate on a topic that could probably could probably fill several courses, not just one debate at the end of a class on neural computation. But we wanted the class to end with a little bit of a more fun but still thought-provoking topic, something to keep everyone engaged, even though there's no final for the class. So thank you all for making it this far in the class and coming to the debate and participating. I'll close us out with some final words here. Dr. Park and I have very much enjoyed teaching you all about a topic that we both find very fascinating, which is why we became researchers in this area. And we hope we've given you just at very least a taste of all of the interesting things that we can try to learn about the brain through these mathematical and computational methods. And we know that some of you came into the course with maybe a little bit of a light programming background. So we hope that this exposure was not too brutal for those of you who are new to programming, and hopefully you've seen some of the things that you can do with programming environments like MATLAB and other mathematical modeling methods. And we hope that even if you don't go on to use all these tools in the future, that it at least taught you some new things about how scientists try to approach difficult problems, like how is the brain taking in all of this information and doing computations and producing behaviors. And maybe one day we'll be able to more quantitatively answer questions about things like consciousness, and perhaps even some clever person will come up with a way to measure these more philosophical seeming concepts like qualia. So thank you all so much for joining us in the class this semester. Good luck on all of your final exams. Have a safe winter holidays for you and your families, and it's been a pleasure teaching you all.